Captain Blackwood had pillaged 100 coastal towns, but he'd never had a child chase after him through the smoky ruins. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7, her bare feet slapping against the cobblestones as she called out to him. "Pirate, please come with me," she cried, tugging at his weathered coat with surprising determination. His crew laughed as they loaded stolen goods onto their ship, but something in her desperate eyes made him pause. He'd spent 20 years hardening his heart against mercy, building a reputation that struck fear into every port from here to the Caribbean. Children usually ran screaming from his scarred face and wild beard, but this one stood there pleading, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. Against every instinct that had kept him alive in a world of cutthroats and betrayers, Captain Blackwood found himself asking a question that would change everything. What could possibly be so important that a child would beg help from a monster like him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass compass in Captain Blackwood's weathered hand no longer pointed true north. Like everything else in his life, it had been corrupted by years of violence and greed. He studied its trembling needle as smoke drifted across Port Isabella's harbor, the acrid smell of burning thatch mixing with the salt spray that had been his constant companion for 2 decades. His ship, the Crimson Revenge, sat anchored beyond the harbor's mouth like a predator waiting to strike again. Her black hull gleamed with fresh tar, and the blood-red sails that gave her name hung limp in the still air. She was beautiful in the way that deadly things often are, every line of her design crafted for speed and intimidation. "Captain," Rodriguez called from the gangplank, his scarred face split by a grin that revealed more gaps than teeth. "The lads have loaded the last of the silver. We pulled enough coin from this cursed place to keep us drunk for a month." His first mate's laughter carried across the water, harsh and grating like a saw blade against bone. Blackwood pocketed the compass without responding. Once, that instrument had belonged to Captain William Ashford of His Majesty's Royal Navy, a man who had believed in honor and duty with the fervor of youth. That man had died 15 years ago in the Caribbean, betrayed by those he'd trusted most, and left to rot on a disease-ridden prison hulk. What emerged from that floating hell was something harder, something that had learned to take what it needed to survive. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. First came the escape, swimming through shark-infested waters with nothing but hatred to keep him warm. Then the months of stealing and scraping, learning that mercy was a luxury only the strong could afford. The day he first killed a man, he'd vomited for hours afterward. By his 10th kill, he barely noticed the blood on his hand. His crew respected him because they feared him, and they feared him because he'd proven time and again that he would do whatever was necessary to keep them alive and wealthy. Black Pete, the ship's cook, could navigate by the stars but preferred using his cleaver to settle disputes. Young Tom had joined them at 16, and now, 5 years later, could slit a throat as easily as tying a knot. Maria Santos, the only woman among them, had earned her place by being deadlier than any 2 men when crossed. They were killers all, but they were his killers. The code that bound them was simple: loyalty to the crew above all else, an equal share of every prize, and death to any who betrayed their brothers. It had served them well through dozens of raids along the Spanish Main and the American coast. Port Isabella had been a particularly rich target. The merchants here had grown fat and careless, trusting too much in their distance from the major shipping lanes. The town's single guard tower had fallen within minutes of their assault, and the local militia had scattered like leaves before a hurricane. By noon, they'd emptied every counting house and stripped the church of its silver. It should have been a perfect raid, clean, profitable, with minimal resistance. Yet as Blackwood watched his men celebrate their latest victory, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the morning light illuminated the devastation they'd caused, or the silence that had replaced the bustling sounds of commerce and daily life. Where once there had been vendors calling their wares and children playing in the streets, Now there was only the crackle of burning buildings and the distant sound of weeping. He'd grown skilled at ignoring such sounds over the years. Collateral damage was inevitable in their line of work. The weak suffered so the strong could prosper. That was the natural order of things. Pirates didn't create that system, they simply exploited it with more honesty than most. But something about this place tugged at memories he'd spent years burying. The narrow streets reminded him of Portsmouth, where he'd spent his childhood before the sea called to him. The smell of baking bread that still lingered near the destroyed bakery brought back images of his mother's kitchen, warm and safe and lost forever. "Cap," Rodriguez called again, his voice sharp with concern. "You're staring at nothing like a man who's seen a ghost. The tide turns in an hour, and I'd rather not explain to the Spanish Navy why we lingered." Blackwood shook himself back to the present. His first mate was right. They'd already stayed longer than was prudent. Word of their raid would spread quickly, and every moment they remained increased the risk of encountering a naval patrol with more guns than sense. 5 more minutes, he told Rodriguez, surprising himself with the word, "I want to check something." That's when he saw her, a small figure detaching itself from the shadows between 2 burned buildings, moving with purpose toward the harbor. The child who would change everything. The child moved through the devastation with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate danger. Her dress, once blue like summer sky, was now stained with soot and tears. In her small hands she clutched a wooden doll so worn that its features had been smoothed away by countless nights of comfort-seeking fingers. Blackwood found himself studying her approach with the same attention he'd once given to enemy ships on the horizon. She couldn't be more than 7 years old, with dark hair that had escaped whatever arrangement it had started the day in. A torn ribbon of faded silk still clung to one tangled strand, the only splash of color in her ash-covered world. "Rodriguez," he called to his first mate without taking his eyes off the approaching figure. "Return to the ship. Begin preparations for departure." "Captain?" Rodriguez's scarred face creased with confusion. "What about checking whatever you wanted to check? I'll handle it myself." The authority in Blackwood's voice brooked no argument, though he could feel his crew's puzzled stares burning into his back. The girl reached him as his men began their reluctant retreat toward the longboats. Up close he could see that her eyes held an intelligence that seemed far too old for her face. She looked up at him, without the terror that usually marked his encounters with civilians, studying his scarred features and wild black beard with the calculating gaze of someone making an important decision. "You're the pirate captain," she said. It wasn't a question. Blackwood nodded slowly. Children usually fled screaming from his presence, their parents having filled their heads with stories of monsters who sailed the seas, stealing everything they could carry. This one stood her ground with a composure that seemed almost supernatural. "My name is Elena," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears that had dried in tracks down her cheeks. "I need you to come with me. Do you now?" Blackwood found himself almost smiling at her directness. And why would a pirate captain follow a little girl anywhere? Elena's grip tightened on her wooden doll, and for the first time he saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her features. "Because you're strong enough to help, and because I don't have anyone else to ask." The simple honesty of her words hit him harder than any cannon blast. Around them the ruins of Port Isabella smoldered in the afternoon heat. Overturned carts and scattered goods told the story of merchants and shopkeepers who had fled in panic as his crew descended like wolves upon the town. Windows stared blindly from buildings that would never again house the families who had called them home. "Help with what?" he asked, though something in his chest told him he didn't want to know the answer. Elena turned and began walking away from the harbor, her bare feet picking their way carefully through the debris-strewn street. "My mama is dying," she said without looking back. "And my brothers and sister are hungry." Blackwood stood rooted to the spot, watching her small figure disappear around a corner. Every instinct screamed at him to return to his ship, to sail away with his crew and their stolen treasure before the authorities arrived. He'd built his reputation on being unpredictable in battle, but utterly reliable in retreat. His men trusted him to keep them alive and wealthy, not to risk their necks for the sob stories of children whose families he'd likely helped to ruin. But something about Elena's quiet desperation called to a part of him he'd thought long dead. Perhaps it was the way she'd looked at him without fear, seeing something in his face that even he had forgotten existed. Or perhaps it was simply that after 20 years of taking what he wanted, he couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked him for help. His feet began moving before his mind had made the decision. He followed the path Elena had taken, leaving behind the familiar sounds of his crew preparing for departure. The narrow streets of Port Isabella's residential quarter bore less obvious signs of the morning's raid, though broken shutters and abandoned belongings spoke of families who had fled in haste. The smell changed as he moved away from the harbor, gone with a familiar sense of salt and tar, replaced by the domestic aromas of cooking fires and laundry soap. It was the smell of ordinary life, the kind he'd forgotten existed beyond the confines of his ship. Elena waited for him at the next corner, her expression unreadable. She'd known he would follow. Somehow, this child had read something in his face that told her the monster might still remember how to be a man. "This way," she said simply, and continued walking deeper into the maze of narrow streets where his cannons had never reached, and his reputation meant nothing to the grinding poverty that had claimed this corner of the world long before any pirate arrived. The shack stood at the end of a narrow alley where the cobblestones gave way to packed dirt, and hope seemed to have died years before any pirate ever set foot in Port Isabella. Its walls leaned inward, like a house of cards on the verge of collapse, held together by stubbornness and the desperate prayers of those who called it home. Elena pushed open a door that hung crooked on leather hinges, the wood so warped that it scraped against the earthen floor. The sound echoed in the single room beyond like a death rattle, and Blackwood found himself hesitating on the threshold. The smell hit him first. Not the clean salt air he'd grown accustomed to, but the thick, sweet odor of sickness mixed with unwashed bodies and desperation. Sunlight struggled through a single window covered with oiled paper, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows seem deeper and more threatening. A woman lay on a straw mattress in the corner, her breathing shallow and labored. Even in the dim light, Blackwood could see that fever had claimed her, turning her skin waxy and pale. Her dark hair, the same shade as Elena's, was plastered to her scalp with sweat. On her finger, a thin band of gold caught what little light filtered through the window, a wedding ring that seemed impossibly bright in the surrounding gloom. 3 children huddled together on a pile of rags near the opposite wall. 2 boys, perhaps 4 and 6 years old, watched Blackwood with the wide, frightened eyes of small animals cornered by a predator. Between them sat a girl who couldn't have been more than 3, sucking on her thumb with the mechanical persistence of someone who had learned that comfort must be self-provided. "Mama," Elena whispered, kneeling beside the mattress. "I brought someone who might help." The woman's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on the massive figure filling her doorway. When her gaze finally settled on Blackwood's scarred face and wild beard, fear flickered across her features before being replaced by the resigned acceptance of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. "You're one of them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One of the pirates." Blackwood nodded, unsure why he felt compelled to honesty in this place where lies might have been kinder. "I am." "Then you've come to finish what your brothers started." Maria closed her eyes, as if the effort of keeping them open had become too much to bear. "Take what you want. There's nothing left here worth stealing." Elena's hand found her mother's, small fingers intertwining with larger ones that felt hot as coals. "He's not here to hurt us, Mama. I asked him to come." "Elena, no." The protest came out as barely more than a breath. "You don't understand what these men are." But Blackwood was beginning to understand something else entirely. He stepped into the room, his boots seeming absurdly large on the dirt floor, and surveyed the family's meager possessions. A cooking pot with a hole in the bottom, carefully patched with clay. A few pieces of clothing hung on wooden pegs, mended so many times that the original fabric was more thread than cloth. In one corner, A small pile of turnips and potatoes, perhaps a week's worth of food, if stretched carefully. The youngest boy whimpered and pressed closer to his siblings, and Blackwood realized with a start that the sound wasn't fear. It was hunger. The kind of deep, gnawing hunger that he'd known himself during those first desperate months after his escape from the prison hulk. "When did you last eat?" he asked Elena, though he dreaded the answer. "Yesterday," she replied without hesitation. "We had soup." "What kind of soup?" Elena's pause told him everything he needed to know. "Water soup," she admitted finally, "with some turnip peelings Mama saved from before she got sick." Blackwood felt something cold settle in his stomach. His crew had dined on fresh bread and salt pork, taken from the town's stores, while this family survived on vegetable scraps and dirty water. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent the morning stealing silver and gold while children starved within sight of his ship. "How long has your mother been ill?" he asked, though he could guess the answer from the smell in the room and the way the children had learned to fend for themselves. 3 weeks, Elena said. "Maybe 4. She stopped getting up after Papa." She stopped herself, glancing toward her mother's still form. "After your father, what?" "After Papa didn't come home from fishing." Elena's voice remained steady, but Blackwood saw her free hand clench into a small fist. "The men in the big ship with red sails came, and Papa didn't come home." The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. Red sail. There was only one ship in these waters that matched that description, and she was anchored just beyond the harbor mouth, with his flag flying from her mainmast. Maria's eyes opened when she heard Elena mention the red sails, and for a moment lucidity cut through the fever like sunlight through storm clouds. She struggled to sit up, her thin frame trembling with the effort, and Blackwood found himself stepping forward instinctively before catching himself. "Don't," Maria whispered, though whether she was speaking to him or fighting against her own memories, he couldn't tell. "Don't speak of that day." Elena moved to support her mother, small arms surprisingly strong as she helped the woman lean against the wall. "Mama, you shouldn't sit up. You need to rest." "No." Maria's voice gained strength, fueled by something deeper than fever. "If this man is here, if he sails with those who took my husband, then he needs to know what his people did." Blackwood remained silent, though every instinct told him to leave before he heard words that would make sleep impossible for years to come. But Elena's eyes held him in place, dark and pleading, as if she understood that this story needed telling, and he needed to hear it. "Diego was a good man," Maria began, her gaze fixed on something beyond the walls of their small home. "He fished these waters for 15 years, knew every current and reef like they were old friends. Never took more than his family needed, always shared his catch with those who had less." She paused, drawing breath that rattled in her chest. "The morning he died, he kissed each of us goodbye, even little Anna, though she was barely walking then." From somewhere beneath the straw mattress, Maria withdrew a folded piece of paper, water-stained and worn soft by countless readings. She pressed it to her chest like a talisman before offering it to Elena with shaking hands. "Read it," she told her daughter. "Let him hear Diego's words." Elena unfolded the paper with reverent care, smoothing the creases against her torn dress. In the dim light, Blackwood could see neat handwriting, the careful script of a man who had learned his letters late in life, but valued their power. "My dearest Maria," Elena read, her young voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow. "If you are reading this, then I have not returned from the sea as I promised. Know that my last thoughts were of you and our beautiful children. I go to fish the deep waters today because the catch near shore has been poor, and winter comes whether we are ready or not." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I have hidden what little money we have saved beneath the loose stone by the hearth. It is not much, but it should buy food for a few weeks if you are careful. Tell the children that their papa loved them more than all the fish in the ocean, and that someday when they are grown, they will understand why a man must sometimes risk everything to provide for his family." Maria's hand found the gold ring on her finger, twisting it with nervous fingers. "He sold his father's fishing boat to buy me this ring when we married," she said. Insisted I should have something beautiful, even if we had nothing else. I could have sold it a dozen times these past months, but I couldn't. It's all I have left of the man he was before the sea took him. Blackwood watched this small woman cling to her last precious thing, while her children survived on vegetable scraps, and felt something crack inside his chest. In his world, sentiment was weakness, and attachment was a luxury that got men killed. Yet here was a kind of strength he'd never encountered, the power to hold on to love, even when it cost everything. What happened to him? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Maria's fever-bright eyes focused on his face with startling intensity. The other fisherman found his boat 3 days later, drifting empty in the current. The nets were cut, not torn by rocks or fish, cut clean through with sharp steel. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There was blood on the deck, not much, but enough. Alina had stopped reading, her small hands clutching the letter like a lifeline. The men who found Papa's boat said they saw the ship with red sails in the distance that morning. They said there was laughing carried on the wind. The words hit Blackwood like cannon. He remembered that day 6 months ago, remembered Rodriguez and Black Pete amusing themselves by harassing local fishing boats, while the crew searched for a safe harbor to make repairs. They'd claimed it was just sport, harmless intimidation to keep the locals afraid, but he knew his men well enough to understand how sport could turn deadly when boredom and bloodlust combined. Did they take anything? He asked, already knowing the answer would make everything worse. His nets, Maria's 20 years' worth of work, nets he'd mended and improved and passed down from his father. They cut them free and left him with nothing. Diego tried to stop them. Blackwood closed his eyes, seeing the scene too clearly. A lone fisherman facing armed pirates, fighting not for treasure or glory, but for the tools that fed his family. His crew would have found the man's desperation amusing, his courage an insult to be answered with steel. Elena reached into the folds of her mother's dress and withdrew something that made Blackwood's blood turn to ice in his veins. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful, hanging from a delicate chain that had been mended in several places with careful stitches of thread. Papa gave this to Mama before they were married, Elena said, opening the locket with practiced fingers. He said it belonged to his grandmother, and that it would keep us safe as long as we remembered how much he loved us. Inside the locket was a miniature portrait, painted with the skill of someone who understood that some faces deserved to be preserved forever. The man in the picture had kind eyes and calloused hands, the weathered features of someone who had spent his life working under the sun and salt spray. But it was the scar above his left eyebrow that made Blackwood's heart stop beating. He knew that scar. He had watched Rodriguez give it to the man with a casual flick of his cutlass, laughing as blood ran down the fisherman's face while he begged for his nets. The memory came flooding back with perfect, terrible clarity, the way the man had fought even after being wounded, the desperate strength of a father trying to save the tools his family needed to survive. We keep his picture close, Elena continued, unaware of the storm raging behind Blackwood's eyes. Mama says that as long as we remember Papa's face, he's not really gone. He's just fishing in deeper waters, where the catch is always good and the storms never come. Blackwood stared at the miniature portrait and remembered everything. The date had been burned into his memory, not because of the fisherman's death, but because it was the day Rodriguez had finally gone too far. They'd been making repairs in a secluded cove, waiting for the heat to die down after a particularly profitable raid on a Spanish treasure ship. The crew was restless, eager for action, and Rodriguez had suggested they have some fun with the local fishing boats. It was supposed to be simple intimidation. Approach a lone fisherman, demand tribute, take whatever looked valuable, and send him running back to shore with stories that would keep other boats away from their hiding place. Clean, efficient, profitable. But Diego hadn't run, even when Rodriguez drew his cutlass, even when Black Pete loaded his pistol with theatrical flourish. The fisherman had stood his ground on the deck of his small boat. He'd spoken in rapid Spanish, gesturing toward the shore where his family waited, trying to make them understand that those nets were worth more than his life. Rodriguez had found the man's courage amusing at first. He'd circled the fishing boat like a shark, making increasingly cruel demands, cutting pieces from the nets, just to watch the fisherman's face crumble with each severed rope. But when Diego had finally snapped and grabbed for Rodriguez's cutlass, the sport had turned deadly. Blackwood had been below deck when it happened, checking charts and planning their next move. He'd heard the laughter, the splash, the sudden silence that meant someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When he'd emerged topside, Rodriguez was wiping blood from his blade, while Black Pete tossed the last of the fishing nets overboard. "Stupid bastard, thirsted to take my weapon," Rodriguez had explained with a shrug. "Had to teach him some manners." They'd sailed away minutes later, leaving Diego's boat to drift empty in the current while his blood dried brown on the deck. Blackwood had ordered Rodriguez never to mention the incident again, telling himself it was just another casualty of the life they'd chosen. Fishermen died in storms all the time. This was no different, except it was different, because the man in Elena's locket had a name and a family and children who still waited for him to come home. He died not for treasure or glory, but for lengths of rope that meant the difference between survival and starvation for the people he loved. He was brave, Blackwood said quietly, the words feeling like confession and absolution combined. Elena nodded, closing the locket with gentle fingers. "Mama says brave men don't look for fights, but they don't run away when fights come looking for them. She says Papa was the bravest man in the whole world." Maria's fever-bright eyes found Blackwood's face, and he saw something there that cut deeper than any blade. Not hatred or fear, but a terrible, exhausted hope that maybe somehow this stranger might possess the power to ease her children's suffering. "I'm dying," she said simply. "The fever, it's been too long. Even if we had medicine, even if we had food, I think my body has forgotten how to heal." She gestured weakly toward her children. "They need someone to care for them. Elena tries, but she's just a baby herself." Blackwood looked at Elena, who was indeed trying to be an adult in a 7-year-old's body, and felt the full weight of what his choices had set in motion. Diego's death had been just another day's work to Rodriguez, but for this family it had been the beginning of a slow slide toward catastrophe that would claim them all unless something changed. Blackwood reached into his coat pocket and felt the cold weight of a Spanish piece of 8, one of hundreds they'd taken during the morning's raid. As his fingers closed around the coin, he felt something wet and sticky on its surface. When he pulled his hand back into the dim light, his fingertips were stained dark red. The blood belonged to Diego. He was certain of it now, though 6 months had passed since Rodriguez had wiped his blade clean on the fisherman's shirt before tossing the body overboard. Somehow that blood had found its way onto this coin, marking it with a stain that all the ocean's salt could never wash away. Elena watched him with those two old eyes, still holding her father's locket against her chest like a shield against the world's cruelty. Her 3 siblings had fallen asleep huddled together on their pile of rags, exhausted by hunger and the day's trauma. Only the soft sound of their breathing broke the terrible silence that had settled over the small room. "You knew him," Imara said. It wasn't a question. Somehow this child had read the truth in his face, seen through the careful mask he'd worn for 20 years of pillaging and murder. Blackwood nodded, unable to trust his voice. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, abandoning the solid ground of lies and justifications that had allowed him to sleep at night. "Your papa was a brave man," he said finally, "braver than anyone should have to be." Maria's breathing had grown more labored, each inhalation a visible struggle, but her eyes remained fixed on Blackwood's face with an intensity that seemed to burn through flesh and bone to examine his very soul. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me what happened to my husband." Blackwood closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him like a tide of poison. He could see Diego's face clearly now, no longer just another nameless victim, but a real person with calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes. A man who had kissed his children goodbye and never imagined he wouldn't be there to tuck them into bed. "He fought for you," Blackwood said, opening his eyes to meet Maria's gaze. "When my men took his nets, he fought like a lion to save them. Not because they were valuable, but because he knew you needed them to survive." Elena's grip tightened on the locket, her knuckles white with the strain. Did he say anything about us?" "He spoke your names," Blackwood lied, though in his heart he knew it should have been true. "Maria, Elena, Miguel, Carlos, Anna. He said them like prayers." The truth was, Diego had screamed in Spanish, words that Blackwood hadn't understood at the time, but could now translate through the lens of Elena's desperate love. The fisherman had been begging, not for his life, but for his, trying to explain that his family would starve without them, that his children were small and innocent and shouldn't pay the price for their father's unlucky encounter with pirates. Rodriguez had laughed at the man's desperation. Black Pete had suggested they take the boat as well, leave Diego to swim home empty-handed as a lesson to other fishermen who might consider resistance. But Diego had grabbed for Rodriguez's cutlass then, choosing death over the slow starvation that awaited his family. Blackwood remembered the sickening sound of steel parting flesh, the way Diego had looked surprised as blood bloomed across his shirt. The fisherman had fallen to his knees, still reaching for his nets even as life fled his body. His last act had been to try saving the tools his children needed to survive. "I should have stopped it," Blackwood said, the words scraping his throat raw. "I was their captain. I could have given the order to leave him alone, to find our sport elsewhere. But I was below deck, and when I came up, it was already over." "Would you have stopped it?" Elena asked with the terrible directness that only children possessed. "If you had been there, would you have saved my pup?" Blackwood wanted to lie, to give this child the comfort of believing her father's death could have been prevented. But Elena deserved better than pretty falsehoods. She deserved the truth, no matter how it carved pieces from his soul. "I don't know," he admitted. "The man I was 6 months ago, I might have let it happen anyway. I'd grown so used to violence that one more death barely registered. Your father was just another obstacle in our path, another casualty of the life we'd chosen." Elena studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that even he couldn't identify. Then she did something that shattered what remained of his carefully constructed defenses. She reached out and took his blood-stained hand in both of hers. "But you're not that man anymore," she said with quiet certainty. "Are you?" Blackwood stared down at their joined hands, his massive and scarred, hers small and soft, despite the calluses that spoke of responsibilities no child should bear. He thought about the 20 years he'd spent running from the pain of betrayal, building walls of cruelty and indifference to protect himself from caring about anything or anyone. All of it crumbled under the weight of a 7-year-old's forgiveness. The medicine bottle felt impossibly heavy in Blackwood's coat pocket as he walked through Port Isabella's winding streets. The glass container was no larger than his fist, but it carried the weight of decisions that could reshape everything he thought he knew about himself. Hernandez had been reluctant to sell the fever remedy to a stranger, especially one whose appearance suggested more familiarity with causing injuries than healing them. But gold spoke louder than suspicion, and Blackwood had paid 3 times the asking price without complaint. The physician's eyes had widened at the generosity, then narrowed with the weariness of a man who understood that pirates rarely gave something for nothing. "This medicine," Hernandez had said, wrapping the bottle in clean cloth with practiced efficiency, "it's powerful, but it must be given carefully. Too little and it won't break the fever. Too much, and..." He'd left the warning unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Blackwood had nodded and pocketed the bottle, adding the doctor's instructions to the growing collection of details that seemed to matter more than they should. When had he started caring about dosages and treatment schedules? When had the survival of one sick woman become more important than maintaining his reputation for ruthless efficiency? The answer walked beside him now, her small hand tucked trustingly into his massive one. Elena had insisted on accompanying him to the doctor's house, claiming she needed to learn how to prepare the medicine properly, but Blackwood suspected she simply couldn't bear to let him out of her sight, afraid that this strange alliance between pirate and child might dissolve like morning mist if she looked away. "Will it really help, Mama?" she asked as they navigated around a pile of debris left by the morning's raid. Her voice carried the careful hope of someone who had learned not to expect miracles, but couldn't quite abandon the possibility. "Dr. Hernandez seems to think so," Blackwood replied, surprised by how much he wanted to believe his own words. "He said your mother is strong, and that with proper medicine and rest, she should recover." Elena nodded solemnly, absorbing this information with the gravity of a general receiving battlefield reports. "And food," she added. "Dr. Hernandez said she needs good food to build her strength back up." That had been the doctor's other prescription, delivered with the blunt honesty of a man who understood that medicine alone couldn't cure poverty. Fresh meat, vegetables, bread made from real flour instead of whatever scraps the family had been grinding into paste. The kind of nutrition that required money Elena's family had never possessed, even before her father's death. But money was something Blackwood had in abundance. His share of the morning's raid alone could feed Elena's family for months, and in his cabin aboard the Crimson Revenge lay treasures accumulated over years of successful piracy. Gold and silver that had once belonged to merchants and nobles who would never miss what they'd lost. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was planning to use stolen wealth to save the family of a man his crew had murdered. It felt like trying to wash blood away with more blood, an equation that could never balance no matter how much gold he threw at it. "Are you really a merchant?" Elena asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the street to study his face with those unnervingly direct eyes. Blackwood paused, caught off guard by the question. "What makes you ask that?" "You told me you were a traveling merchant when we went to see Dr. Hernandez," Elena said. "But merchants don't have scars like yours, and they don't walk like they're always ready for a fight." The child's perceptiveness was unsettling. She'd seen through his hastily constructed cover story with the ease of someone who had learned to read adult deceptions as a matter of survival. Her question demanded honesty, even if the truth might send her running in terror. "No," he said finally, "I'm not a merchant." Elena nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "You're the pirate captain with the red sails. The one whose crew killed my papa." The words hung between them like a blade, sharp and cutting. Blackwood waited for her to scream, to call for help, to realize that she'd been walking hand in hand with the man responsible for her father's death. Instead, Elena simply adjusted her grip on his fingers and resumed walking toward home. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked, genuinely puzzled by her reaction. Elena considered the question with the seriousness that seemed to characterize all her thoughts. "Papa used to tell me stories about pirates," she said. "He said some of them were monsters who ate children and burned down churches for fun, but he also said some of them were just men who had lost their way home." "And which kind do you think I am?" "I think," Elena said carefully, "that you're the kind who remembers what home feels like, even if you haven't been there in a long time." Her words hit him harder than any accusation could have. Home. When was the last time he'd thought of anywhere as home? His ship was a refuge, and his crew a family of sorts. But neither offered the kind of peace that Elena's simple word evoked. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts too complex for easy conversation. When they reached the familiar crooked door of Elena's house, Blackwood found himself hesitating again, the medicine bottle heavy in his pocket like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Elena found the black flag while Blackwood was helping Maria drink the fever medicine. It had fallen from his coat pocket when he knelt beside the straw mattress, the familiar skull and crossed swords catching what little light filtered through the oiled paper window. The silk fabric seemed to pulse with malevolent life in the dim room, a stark reminder of the world he belonged to beyond these crumbling walls. The child picked up the flag with careful fingers, studying the intricate embroidery that marked it as belonging to the Crimson Revenge. Blackwood had commissioned the design himself 15 years ago, wanting something that would strike fear into merchant hearts while honoring the naval traditions he'd once served. The skull wore a tricorn hat, tilted at a rakish angle, and the crossed swords beneath it bore etchings of rope and anchor that spoke to his maritime heritage. "This is your flag," Elena said. Not a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm acceptance she'd shown when learning he was responsible for her father's death. Maria's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her daughter's voice, focusing with effort on the black silk spread across Elena's small lap. Even in her fevered state, she recognized the symbol immediately. Every coastal dweller knew the flag of the Crimson Revenge, whispered about in taverns and fishing villages from here to the Caribbean. "Captain Blackwood," Maria whispered, the name carrying weight like a curse or prayer. "They say you've killed more men than yellow fever." Blackwood set down the medicine bottle, his hands moving slowly to avoid startling either mother or daughter. "They say many things," he replied quietly. "Most of them are true." Elena traced the skull's grinning features with one finger, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful. "How many ships have you taken?" "Too many to count." "How many people have you killed?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Blackwood found himself actually considering the number, trying to tally decades of violence into some meaningful sum. There had been those who died in battle, steel meeting steel in the heat of combat. Others had fallen to his pistol during boarding actions, their last sight his scarred face looming over them. A few had met their end at the end of a rope, hanged for crimes against his crew or for simple betrayal. "I stopped counting after the first 50, he said finally, the truth scraping his throat raw. Elena nodded as if this was exactly the answer she'd expected. Were they all bad men? No. The admission came easier than it should have. Some were just sailors trying to make a living. Some were soldiers following orders. Some were merchants protecting their goods. He paused, meeting Elena's steady gaze. Some were fishermen, defending their nets. Maria made a sound that might have been a sob or simply the fever breaking something loose in her chest. Blackwood reached for the water cup, helping her drink with the same gentle care he'd once reserved for wounded members of his crew. "Why did you become a pirate?" Elena asked, setting the flag aside but keeping her eyes fixed on his face. Blackwood considered lying, spinning some romantic tale of adventure and freedom on the high seas. But this child had already seen through every deception he'd attempted. She deserved the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. "Because I was betrayed by men I trusted," he said. "I was a naval officer once, serving king and country with honor, but my commanding admiral was selling information to enemy ships, and when I discovered his treachery, he framed me for his crimes." Elena listened with the intense focus she brought to everything important, her head tilted slightly as she processed this information. "So you became a bad man because bad men hurt you first?" Simplicity of her question cut through 20 years of justification and self-pity, like a sword through silk. That was exactly what had happened, stripped of all the complex reasoning and philosophical arguments he'd used to excuse his choices. Bad men had hurt him, so he'd decided to become a bad man in return. "Yes," he said simply, "but that didn't make the hurt go away, did it?" Blackwood stared at this 7-year-old child who seemed to understand truths that had eluded him for decades. The pain of betrayal was still there, as fresh and sharp as the day Admiral Thornton had smiled while signing his death warrant. All the revenge and violence and stolen gold had done nothing to heal that wound. They'd simply created new wounds in other people, spreading the infection of cruelty like plague across the Caribbean. From outside came the distant sound of his crew's voices, carried on the evening breeze. They'd grown restless during his absence, and Rodriguez would be asking questions that Blackwood wasn't ready to answer. Soon he would have to choose between the life he'd built and the possibility of something better. "They're looking for you," Elena observed, her small hand finding his again with surprising warmth. "They are. Will you go back to them?" Blackwood looked around the small room that had become the center of his universe over the course of a single afternoon. Maria was already looking stronger, the medicine working its slow magic against the fever that had been killing her. The other children slept peacefully for the first time in months, their bellies full of real food purchased with pirate gold. Elena sat beside him like a tiny guardian angel, unafraid of the monster he'd become because she could still see the man he'd once been. Outside, Rodriguez called his name with growing impatience. Elena's hand-drawn map was crude but surprisingly detailed, created with charcoal on a piece of bark that she'd carefully smoothed flat. She spread it across the dirt floor between them, her small fingers tracing the lines that divided Port Isabella into territories of good and evil, with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "This is where Miss Santos lives," she said, pointing to a small square near what appeared to be the town's center. "She gives bread to hungry children, even when she doesn't have much herself. And here's Father Miguel's church, where people go when they need help and can't pay for it." Blackwood studied the map with growing fascination. Elena had created an entire moral geography of her hometown, marking safe houses and dangerous streets with the precision of a military strategist. Red marks indicated places where bad things happened, the taverns where drunken sailors started fights, the alley where the moneylenders' thugs collected debts with brass knuckles, the warehouse district where girls disappeared and were never seen again. Green marks showed refuges of kindness, the bakery that never turned away hungry children, the widow who took in stray cats and fed them with her own food, the old fisherman who taught boys to mend nets without asking for payment. These islands of compassion were scattered throughout the town like stars in a dark sky, connected by thin lines that Elena had drawn to show safe paths between them. "You made this yourself?" Blackwood asked, impressed despite himself by the sophistication of her work. Elena nodded proudly. "Papa taught me how to draw maps. He said a good fisherman always knows where the safe harbors are and where the rocks hide under the water." Her expression grew thoughtful. "I think people are like that too. Some are safe harbors and some are hidden rocks that can sink your boat if you're not careful." Blackwood considered this metaphor while studying Elena's innocent face. "And what am I?" he asked. "A safe harbor or a hidden rock?" Elena tilted her head, examining him with the serious concentration she brought to all important questions. "I think you used to be a hidden rock," she said finally. "But maybe you're learning how to be a safe harbor instead." Her simple faith in the possibility of transformation struck him like a physical blow. Here was a child who had every reason to hate him, who had lost everything because of choices he'd made or failed to make, yet she still believed he could become something better than what he was. "Why did you really come to me today?" he asked. "When you saw me on the beach, you could have asked anyone for help. Dr. Hernandez, Father Miguel, any of the good people on your map. Why choose a pirate?" Elena folded the map carefully, handling it like the precious thing it was. "Because the good people are already doing everything they can," she said with matter-of-fact practicality. "Mrs. Santos gives us bread when she has extra, and Father Miguel prays for Mama every day, but they don't have enough power to really change things. And you think I do? I know you do." Elena's voice carried absolute certainty. "Pirates take whatever they want whenever they want it. That's power. The question is what you're going to want to take." Blackwood stared at this 7-year-old philosopher, amazed by her ability to cut through complex moral questions with the clarity of someone who had never learned that some problems were supposed to be impossible to solve. She was right, of course. He did have power. The power that came from ships and guns and men who would follow orders without question. He'd simply never considered using that power for anything beyond acquiring more power. "What would you want me to take?" he asked, genuinely curious about her answer. Elena smiled then, the first truly happy expression he'd seen cross her face since their meeting began. "I'd want you to take the fear away," she said. "The fear that makes Mama cry when she thinks we're sleeping. The fear that makes little Carlos wake up screaming because he thinks the pirates are coming back. The fear that makes me count our food every morning to see how many more days we can survive. Outside, Rodriguez's voice had grown closer, accompanied now by the heavier footsteps of other crew members. They were conducting a systematic search of the residential quarter, moving from house to house with the methodical thoroughness that had made them so effective at hunting down hidden treasure. "They're almost here," Elena observed, showing no sign of panic, despite the approaching danger. "They are. Will you fight them?" Blackwood considered the question seriously. His crew numbered 15 men, all of them hardened by years of violence and absolutely loyal to him personally. But that loyalty was based on success and shared danger, not on any deeper bond of affection. If he showed weakness, if he chose Elena's family over their collective interests, that loyalty would evaporate like morning mist. "Fighting them would be suicide," he said honestly. "They're good men in a fight, and they trust each other completely." "Then what will you do?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning two different worlds. On one side lay everything Blackwood had built over 20 years of piracy: wealth, reputation, the grim satisfaction of being feared throughout the Caribbean. On the other side waited uncertainty, the possibility of redemption balanced against the certainty of losing everything he'd worked to achieve. "I don't know," he admitted, and felt something strange and unfamiliar stir in his chest. For the first time in decades, he was facing a choice where the outcome mattered more than simple survival or profit. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway like a specter from Blackwood's violent past, his scarred face twisted into the familiar sneer that had intimidated countless victims across the Caribbean. Behind him crowded Black Pete and young Tom, their hands resting casually on the hilts of their cutlasses, with the practiced ease of men who had killed for far less provocation than finding their captain consorting with the enemy. Well, Rodriguez drawled, his cold eyes taking in the scene with predatory interest. "Our fearsome Captain Blackwood, playing nursemaid to a family of peasants. The lads are going to find this very amusing." Blackwood rose slowly from beside Maria's mattress, his own hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his belt. But Elena was too close, still clutching her hand-drawn map like a shield against the evil that had just invaded her small sanctuary. One wrong move, one moment of violence, and this child who had shown him such faith might pay the price for his past choices. "Rodriguez," he said calmly, though every instinct screamed at him to draw steel and settle this the way pirates had always settled their differences. "I told you to prepare the ship for departure." "Aye, and we've been ready for 2 hours," Rodriguez replied, stepping fully into the room with the casual arrogance of a man who feared nothing on earth. "The tide's turning, and every minute we linger increases our chances of meeting a Spanish patrol with more cannon than sense." Black Pete moved to Rodriguez's left, positioning himself to block any escape through the room's single window. The cook's massive frame filled the space like a mountain of muscle and malice, his cleaver hanging from his belt, next to a collection of smaller knives that he claimed were for preparing meals but had proven equally effective at preparing corpses. "What's got into you, Captain?" young Tom asked from the doorway, his boyish features marred by the kind of premature cynicism that came from witnessing too much cruelty at an impressionable age. "Since when do we waste time on charity work?" Elena had gone very still, her dark eyes moving between the pirates with the careful attention of a small animal surrounded by predators. But she didn't run, or scream, or beg for mercy. Instead, she stepped closer to Blackwood, her small hand finding his with a trust that made his heart ache. "These are your men," she said, not a question but an observation delivered with the same calm acceptance she'd shown toward everything else in her young life. "They are," Rodriguez's sneer widened as he took in this display of misplaced loyalty. "The little brat's got more courage than sense," he observed. "Rather like her father, wouldn't you say?" The casual cruelty of the reference hit Blackwood like a cannon shot. Rodriguez knew exactly what he was doing, invoking the memory of Diego's death to remind everyone present of the natural order of things. Pirates took what they wanted from those too weak to stop them. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness was death. "Leave the child out of this," Blackwood said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of command. "Leave her out of what?" Rodriguez's hand drifted toward his cutlass, the movement casual but unmistakably threatening. A discussion between old friends about the nature of leadership. Maria struggled to sit up, despite her weakness, maternal instinct overriding the fever that had nearly claimed her life. "Elena, come here," she whispered, though her daughter made no move to leave Blackwood's side. Black Pete chuckled, a sound like grinding millstones. "The captain's gone soft, Rodriguez. All these years of hard living, and he's finally cracked. Happens to the best of them eventually. Does..." Rodriguez drew his cutlass with theatrical slowness, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "And what do we do with captains who've lost their edge?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Every man in that room knew the answer. Pirate crews followed strength, not sentiment. A captain who couldn't make the hard choices, who put personal feelings above the welfare of his men, was a liability that would get them all killed or captured. Elena looked up at Blackwood with those two wise eyes, and he saw something there that cut deeper than any blade. Not fear for herself, but fear for him. This child who had lost everything was worried about what might happen to the pirate who had helped destroy her life. "Don't hurt him," she said, addressing Rodriguez with the fearless directness that had first captured Blackwood's attention. "He's trying to be good." Rodriguez laughed, a harsh sound that seemed to suck warmth from the air. "Good? Little girl, there's no such thing as a good pirate. We're all monsters here, and the sooner you learn that, the longer you might live." "No," Elena said firmly, tightening her grip on Blackwood's hand. "Monsters don't bring medicine to sick mothers. Monsters don't hold hands with little girls. Monsters don't feel sorry when they've done something wrong." The simple truth of her words silenced the room. Even Rodriguez seemed momentarily at a loss, confronted by a child who refused to accept the cynical worldview that had shaped all their lives. In that moment of quiet, Blackwood felt something shift inside him, like the thin of a tide that had been held back too long. He was done running from the man he could have been. Elena's courage had given Blackwood the moment he needed to act, but it was the sound of rustling papers beneath Maria's mattress that changed everything. As Rodriguez advanced with his cutlass raised, his boot caught the edge of a loose board, revealing a hidden compartment that Maria had tried desperately to conceal with her weakened hands. Documents scattered across the dirt floor, their official seals and elegant handwriting immediately recognizable to anyone who had spent time in naval service. Rodriguez bent to examine them, his sneer faltering as he read the elaborate script that proclaimed William Ashford's commission as captain in His Majesty's Royal Navy. "Well, well," Rodriguez said slowly, his voice carrying a new and dangerous note. "It seems our Captain Blackwood has been keeping secrets from his loyal crew." Black Pete snatched up another document, squinting at words he could barely read, but understanding their significance nonetheless. "Royal pardon," he growled, "signed by the Governor of Jamaica himself. This says you were framed for treason, cleared of all charges." The third paper was the most damning of all, a letter of recommendation from Admiral Morrison, praising William Ashford's courage and integrity, expressing regret for the injustices he had suffered, and offering him a position in the colonial administration whenever he chose to reclaim his honor. Young Tom looked up from the scattered documents with the wounded expression of a son discovering his father's lies. "You could have gone back," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "All this time you could have been a respectable man again. Why didn't you tell us?" Blackwood felt the weight of Elena's hand in his, anchoring him to a truth he'd been running from for 15 years. The documents had been delivered to various ports throughout the Caribbean, following his reputation as he built his legend as a pirate captain. Each time they caught up with him, he'd hidden them away, telling himself he was protecting his crew from knowledge that might make them question his commitment to their shared life of crime. "Because I was afraid," he said simply, the admission scraping his throat raw. "Afraid that if you knew I had a choice, you'd realize that everything we've done together was built on my cowardice." Rodriguez's cutlass trembled with suppressed fury. "Coward, you call leading us through 20 years of raids and battles. Cowardice? I call it hiding, Blackwood replied, meeting his first mate's eyes with unflinching honesty. I was so afraid of facing the men who betrayed me that I convinced myself I was better off as an outlaw. I told myself that society had failed me, so I owed it nothing in return. Alina tugged at his hand, her small voice cutting through the tension like a bell through storm winds. What changed your mind? Blackwood looked down at this child who had lost everything because of his choices, yet still stood beside him with unwavering faith. You did, he said. You showed me that running away from who I was meant becoming someone I never should have been. Rodriguez snarled and raised his cutlass higher, the blade catching what little light filtered through the oiled paper window. Pretty words won't save you from the consequences of betraying your crew. We followed you through hell and back, and this is how you repay our loyalty. Your loyalty was built on a lie, Blackwood said, his hand moving slowly toward his own weapon. You followed Captain Blackwood because you thought he had no other choice, but William Ashford always had a choice, and now he's making it. The transformation was visible, like watching a man shed a skin that had never quite fit properly. The pirate captain's swagger gave way to the straight-backed bearing of a naval officer, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned his rank through merit, rather than fear. I'm ordering you to stand down, he said, using the tone that had once commanded frigates in battles against enemy fleets. Return to the ship and divide my share of the treasure among yourselves. Consider it payment for 20 years of service. Black Pete spat on the dirt floor, his massive frame trembling with rage. And what about justice for all the risks we took on your orders? What about the men who died following your lead? They died following a lie, Blackwood replied. A lie I told myself every day for 20 years, but I won't dishonor their memory by continuing to live it. Rodriguez's attack came without warning, his cutlass slicing through the air toward Blackwood's throat with lethal precision. But Elena had been watching her new protector's face, reading the subtle signs that indicated violence was about to erupt. Her sharp cry of warning gave Blackwood the split second he needed to draw his own blade and turn certain death into merely mortal combat. Steel rang against steel in the confined space, the sound echoing off the walls like church bells announcing Judgment Day. Maria gathered her younger children close, shielding them from the violence that had invaded their sanctuary, while Elena pressed herself against the wall but refused to look away. The fight that followed would determine not just who lived and who died, but what kind of man William Ashford would choose to be when the last blade fell silent. Blackwood's fingers closed around the familiar weight of his naval officer's sword, hidden beneath the loose floorboard where Elena had shown him her most precious possessions. The blade emerged from its oiled cloth wrapping like a piece of his forgotten soul, the steel still bright despite 15 years of neglect. Etched along its fuller were the words, "Honor before glory," a motto that had once guided every decision he made. The transformation was immediate and profound. Where Captain Blackwood fought like a brawler, all brutal efficiency and calculated violence, Captain William Ashford moved with the precise elegance of formal training. His stance shifted from the wide-legged aggression of a pirate to the measured poise of a king's officer. Every movement economical and purposeful, Rodriguez circled him like a hungry shark, his cutlass weaving hypnotic patterns in the dim air. 20 years I've followed you, he snarled between testing strikes. 20 years of believing we were brothers in blood and salt. And all this time you were just another naval peacock, slumming with the criminal classes for entertainment. You were never my entertainment, Blackwood replied, parrying a vicious thrust that would have opened his throat. You were my family when I had no other. But family doesn't mean following each other into damnation. Elena pressed herself against the wall, her dark eyes reflecting the deadly dance of steel on steel. She watched not with the terror most children would show, but with the intense focus of someone studying a problem that needed solving. Her small hands clutched the wooden doll that had been her comfort through so many dark nights, its worn features bearing silent witness to violence that should never touch innocent lives. Black Pete and young Tom flanked the combatants, ready to intervene if their first mate seemed to be loose, but Rodriguez was a master swordsman himself, trained in the harsh schools of Caribbean piracy. where a single mistake meant death. His blade sought Blackwood's heart with relentless purpose, each strike designed to kill rather than merely wound. "You want to know what changed me?" Blackwood asked, deflecting a cut that would have taken his arm at the shoulder. "It wasn't guilt over the merchants we robbed, or the ships we sank. It was seeing that child stand up to us without fear, because she believed in something better than we ever dared to imagine." Rodriguez's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "The brat? You're throwing away everything we built for a peasant child who'll be dead of disease or starvation within the year." "She'll live," Blackwood said with quiet certainty, pressing his attack with renewed vigor. "She'll live because someone finally had the courage to stand between her and the darkness. Something I should have done for her father." The mention of Diego struck Rodriguez like a physical blow. For just an instant his guard dropped as memory flickered across his scarred features. In that moment of distraction, Blackwood's naval training asserted itself. A perfectly executed lunge pierced Rodriguez's sword arm, forcing him to drop his cutlass with a cry of pain and rage. But the victory was short-lived. Black Pete roared like an angry bear and charged forward, his massive cleaver whistling through the air where Blackwood's head had been a heartbeat earlier. The confined space of Elena's home became a deadly maze as 3 armed men fought for supremacy, while a sick woman and 4 terrified children pressed themselves against the walls. Enough! The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to Elena, barely 7 years old, but carrying authority that made hardened pirates pause mid-strike. She stood in the center of the room, her wooden doll raised like a weapon, her small face blazing with righteous anger. "This is my home," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My mama is sick, my brothers and sister are scared, and you're making everything worse. If you want to fight, go outside and kill each other where my family doesn't have to watch." Young Tom lowered his blade, shame coloring his features as he realized what they'd brought into this sanctuary. Even Black Pete hesitated, his cleaver wavering as Elena's words found their mark. These were men who had been children once themselves, before life and circumstance had turned them into instruments of violence. Rodriguez clutched his wounded arm and glared at the girl with naked hatred. "You think your words matter to men like us? You think we care about your family's comfort? I think you care about his opinion," Elena replied, pointing at Blackwood with her doll. "And I think you know he's not the same man who started following you 20 years ago." Blackwood looked around the room that had become a battlefield, seeing it through Elena's eyes for the first time. The overturned water pitcher, the scattered medicine bottles, the way little Carlos and Ana whimpered behind their mother's protective arms. This wasn't how a man of honor defended the innocent. This was how a pirate solved problems with violence and intimidation, regardless of who got hurt in the process. "She's right," he said, lowering his sword. "This isn't the way." "Then what is?" Rodriguez demanded, blood seeping between his fingers. "You've made your choice, Captain. Now live with the consequences." Outside, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of more crew members, drawn by the sounds of combat. Soon the entire complement of the Crimson Revenge would be here, and Blackwood would face the ultimate test of whether one man's redemption was worth more than 20 men's loyalty. The ship's bell of the Crimson Revenge had rung countless times over the years, calling pirates to battle, to celebration, to the grim business of dividing plunder among those who had risked everything to claim it. But now it remained silent on the evening breeze, its bronze voice stilled like everything else that had once defined Blackwood's world. Maria Santos and Knife-Tooth Jim crowded through the doorway behind the others, their weapons drawn and their faces bearing the hard expressions of men prepared for violence. But when they saw their captain standing over Rodriguez's bleeding form, their certainty wavered like candle flames in a crosswind. Captain Maria Santos spoke first, her voice carrying the confusion of someone who had never seen their leader show mercy to a defeated enemy. "Rodriguez sent word that you'd gone mad, that you were betraying the crew for peasants and sentiment." Blackwood straightened slowly, his naval sword still gripped in his right hand, while his left moved protectively toward Elena. The child had retreated to her mother's side, but her eyes remained fixed on his face with unwavering trust. "Rodriguez was right," Blackwood said simply. "I have betrayed everything we built together. The question is whether that betrayal serves honor or cowardice." Knife-toothed Jim spat through his remaining teeth, the sound echoing wetly in the small room. "Honor? Since when do pirates talk about honor? We take what we want and kill anyone who tries to stop us. That's the only law that matters out here." "It was the only law I knew," Blackwood corrected, noting how his crew had instinctively arranged themselves to block all escape routes. These men had fought beside him through 20 years of violence, had trusted him to lead them safely through storms, both natural and man-made. Now they faced the possibility that their leader had abandoned them for principles they couldn't understand. Young Tom wiped blood from a shallow cut on his cheek, his boyish features twisted with hurt that went deeper than any physical wound. "You taught me everything I know about being a pirate," he said. "How to read the wind, how to judge a merchant's cargo by the way his ship sat in the water, how to kill a man quickly so he doesn't suffer. Was all of that a lie?" Blackwood replied, the honesty of his answer surprising even himself. "Those skills kept us alive and wealthy for 2 decades, but I never taught you how to live with the consequences of using them." Elena stepped forward then, her small hand closing around the wooden doll that had been her constant companion through months of hardship. "He's trying to teach you now," she said, addressing the assembled pirates with the fearless directness that had first captured Blackwood's attention. "He's trying to show you that being strong doesn't have to mean being cruel." Black Pete's massive frame shook with bitter laughter. "Listen to her, lads. A little girl thinks she understands the realities of our world better than men who've lived it. Maybe she does," Blackwood said quiet. "Maybe it takes someone who's never learned to accept cruelty as normal to see how wrong we've all been." Rodriguez struggled to his feet, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side, but his eyes still burning with the fury of a man who felt himself betrayed. "Pretty words won't change the fact that you've chosen them over us," he snarled. 20 years of brotherhood, and you throw it all away for strangers who'll forget your name before the next tide turns. "I'm not throwing anything away," Blackwood replied. "I'm offering you the chance to choose something better than what we've been." Maria Santos raised her pistol, the weapon steady in her practiced grip. "And what if we don't want your offer? What if we prefer the life we've built to whatever noble fantasy you're chasing?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Blackwood looked around the room at faces he'd known longer than any family, men and women who had followed him through hell and back without question or complaint. They deserved better than to be abandoned by the captain they'd trusted with their lives. But Elena's family deserved better too. Maria lying fevered on her straw mattress, the 3 younger children huddled together in fear, Elena herself standing between armed pirates and her loved ones, with nothing but faith to protect her. Someone had to choose mercy over violence, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair. "Then you're free to leave," Blackwood said, making his choice with the finality of a man who had spent too many years running from the consequences of his decisions. "Take your shares of our accumulated wealth and find another captain to follow. But you'll do it without harming anyone in this house." Rodriguez's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "And if we refuse? If we decide that traitors deserve the same fate whether they wear captain's stripes or peasant rags?" Blackwood raised his sword, the blade catching what little light filtered through the oiled paper window. For the first time in 20 years, he felt the weight of steel in his hand, not as a tool of conquest, but as an instrument of protection. "Then you'll have to go through me first," he said. "And I promise you, that won't be as easy as you think." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of waves against the Crimson Revenge's hull, calling to men who might never answer her summons again. Blackwood's pirate coat had been his armor for 20 years, its dark wool bearing the stains of 100 battles and the weight of countless questionable decisions. Now he shrugged it from his shoulders, with deliberate ceremony, letting it fall to the dirt floor of Elena's home, like a snake shedding poisonous skin. Beneath the coat he wore a simple white shirt that had once been part of his naval uniform, carefully preserved through all his years of exile. The fabric was yellowed with age, but still bore the precise creases of military bearing. A ghost of the man he'd been before betrayal had driven him to the Caribbean's lawless waters. "There," he said, standing before his assembled crew in shirt sleeves, his naval sword steady in his grip. "Now you see me as I truly am. Not Captain Blackwood the pirate, but William Ashford, formerly of His Majesty's Royal Navy, currently defending the innocent against those who would do them harm." Rodriguez clutched his wounded arm and bared his teeth in a feral grin. "Ashford died 15 years ago in a Spanish prison hulk. What stands before us now is something else entirely." "You're right," Blackwood replied, surprising everyone, including himself, with the admission. "Ashford died, and Blackwood was born from his corpse. But today, watching this child stand up to armed pirates without flinching, I remembered something I thought was lost forever." Alina pressed closer to her mother's side, her wooden doll clutched against her chest like a talisman. Even in her fear, she watched the unfolding drama with the intense focus that had marked all their interactions, as if she understood that history was being written in blood and steel within the walls of her humble home. "What did you remember?" young Tom asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity despite the tension crackling through the air. "I remembered why I became a naval officer in the first place," Blackwood said, his eyes never leaving Rodriguez's face. "Not for glory or advancement, but to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. To stand between the innocent and those who would prey upon them." Maria Santos laughed harshly, though her pistol never wavered from its target. Noble sentiment from a man who spent 20 years doing exactly the opposite. "How many innocent merchants did we rob? How many peaceful fishing villages did we terrorize? Too many," Blackwood admitted without hesitation. "Too many lives destroyed, too many families scattered, too many children left orphaned by our greed and violence. But that ends today." Black Pete's massive frame trembled with barely contained rage. "And what about our lives? What about the brotherhood we've built? You'd throw all of that away for a moment of misplaced conscience." "I'd trade all of it," Blackwood said firmly, "for the chance to look at myself in a mirror without seeing a monster staring back." The attack came from 3 directions at once, coordinated with the precision that had made the Crimson Revenge's crew legendary throughout the Caribbean. Maria Santos fired her pistol while Knife-Tooth Jim rushed forward with his cutlass raised, and Black Pete swung his massive cleaver in a deadly arc that would have split a man in half. But Blackwood had anticipated their strategy, and 15 years of pirate cunning merged seamlessly with 25 years of naval training. He dove beneath Black Pete's swing while simultaneously parrying Jim's thrust, his own blade finding the cook's ribs with surgical precision. The big man's roar of pain shook dust from the rafters as he stumbled backward, clutching his side. Maria's pistol ball had missed by inches, burying itself in the wall behind where Blackwood's head had been. Before she could reload, he was moving again, his sword pommel catching her wrist with enough force to send the weapon spinning across the room. Elena's sharp cry of warning gave him the split second he needed to avoid Rodriguez's desperate lunge. The wounded first mate had retrieved his cutlass with his good hand, launching himself forward in a final suicidal attack that spoke more of wounded pride than tactical sense. Steel rang against steel in the confined space, but this time the outcome was never in doubt. Rodriguez fought with the fury of a man who had lost everything he believed in, but Blackwood fought with the calm precision of someone who had finally found something worth dying for. The thrust that ended Rodriguez's rebellion was clinical in its efficiency, piercing his heart with the same thoroughness he had once brought to killing Elena's father. But where Rodriguez had laughed over Diego's corpse, Blackwood felt only sadness for the waste of a life that might have been redeemed if pride hadn't demanded a different ending. "It's finished," he said quietly, withdrawing his blade as Rodriguez collapsed to the dirt floor. Around him, the surviving members of his crew stared in shocked silence at the man they no longer recognized. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the first drops of rain began to fall like tears for all the choices that could never be undone. The brass compass that Blackwood withdrew from his pocket gleamed like new gold in the lamplight, its needle now pointing steadily toward true north for the first time in 20 years. He had found it among his possessions aboard the Crimson Revenge, while gathering supplies for Elena's family, and somehow the instrument that had once symbolized his moral confusion now served as proof of his transformation. "True north," he murmured, showing Elena the steady needle as she helped him tend to her mother's improving condition. No more wandering in circles, no more being lost at sea. Elena studied the compass with the serious attention she brought to all important things, her small fingers tracing the brass housing with careful reverence. "Popeye had a compass like this," she said softly. "He said it always pointed home, no matter how far the currents carried him." The word struck Blackwood with unexpected force. Home. For 20 years he had told himself that the Crimson Revenge was his home, that his crew was his family, that the endless pursuit of wealth and reputation was all the purpose a man needed. But sitting in this humble shack, watching Elena's family slowly heal from the wounds his choices had inflicted, he finally understood what home really meant. Maria was sitting up now, her fever broken and her strength returning with each dose of the medicine he had purchased with pirate gold. The younger children no longer flinched when he moved too quickly, and little Anna had even allowed him to help her eat soup without crying. These small victories felt more significant than any treasure he had ever claimed from merchant ships. The surviving members of his crew had departed 3 days ago, sailing away aboard the Crimson Revenge with their shares of accumulated wealth and bitter promises, never to forget his betrayal. Young Tom had been the last to leave, tears streaming down his face as he struggled to understand how the man who had been like a father to him could choose strangers over the family they had built together. "I don't understand," Tom had said, standing on the beach with his sea bag slung over his shoulder. "We were brothers. We swore oaths to each other that were supposed to mean something." "They did mean something," Blackwood had replied, his heart breaking for this young man whose entire worldview had been shattered by his captain's transformation. "They meant that I cared enough about your future to show you that there are better ways to live than the one I taught you." Now, watching Elena carefully copy letters from an old prayer book while her brothers played quietly in the corner, Blackwood felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work that actually matters. He had spent the morning helping Father Miguel organize relief supplies for families affected by various pirate raids, using his knowledge of criminal patterns to predict where aid would be most needed. "The town council wants to meet with you," Elena said without looking up from her writing practice. "Mrs. Santos heard them talking after church. They want to ask you about organizing defenses against other pirates." Blackwood nodded, unsurprised by this development. Word of his transformation had spread quickly through Port Isabella's small community, carried by the curious and the grateful in equal measure. Some viewed him with suspicion, unable to believe that a man could truly change his nature. Others saw him as a resource to be exploited, someone whose intimate knowledge of pirate tactics could be turned to their advantage. "What will you tell them?" Elena asked, finally raising her eyes from the alphabet she had been copying with painstaking care. "The truth," Blackwood replied. "That I know how pirates think because I was one for 20 years. That I understand their weaknesses because I lived with those same weaknesses. And that the best defense against men like I used to be is not walls or weapons, but communities strong enough to care for all their members." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something radiant. "You sound like Papa when he talked about his nets. He said the strongest nets were woven from many small threads, each one supporting all the others." The metaphor was perfect, and Blackwood found himself thinking about the letter of recommendation that still lay hidden beneath Maria's mattress. Admiral Morrison had offered him a position in the colonial administration, a chance to use his skills in service of law and order rather than chaos and greed. It would mean leaving Port Isabella, leaving Elena's family, leaving the first place that had felt like home since his betrayal and exile. But perhaps there were other ways to serve, other threads that could be woven into the community's protective fabric. Perhaps a former pirate's greatest contribution was not to disappear into respectable obscurity, but to stand openly as proof that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to choose it. Outside, the evening breeze carried the sound of children playing in streets that no longer echoed with the fear of pirate raids. It was a small change, almost insignificant in the broader scope of human suffering, but it was real, and it was good. And it had begun with one little girl's faith that monsters could learn to be men again. The letter of recommendation felt heavier than gold in Blackwood's hands as he sat across from Commander Harrison of the Royal Navy, whose ship had arrived in Port Isabella's harbour 3 weeks after the confrontation with his crew. The document bore Admiral Morrison's official seal and offered William Ashford a full pardon, restoration of rank, and a position as Colonial Maritime Security Advisor with authority over anti-piracy operations throughout the Caribbean. "It's a generous offer," Commander Harrison said, his crisp uniform and polished manner a stark reminder of the world Blackwood had abandoned 20 years ago. "Admiral Morrison specifically requested that we locate you and extend this opportunity. Your knowledge of pirate operations could save countless lives." Blackwood studied the younger officer's earnest face, seeing echoes of his own youthful idealism before betrayal had taught him the bitter lessons of institutional politics. Harrison was perhaps 30, with the kind of unwavering faith in duty and honor that Blackwood had once possessed. "What would my duties entail?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Strategic planning, primarily," Harrison replied, consulting a leather portfolio filled with official documents. "Analysis of pirate behavior patterns, recommendations for patrol routes, consultation on defensive measures for vulnerable ports. You'd be based in Port Royal, with authority to travel throughout the colonial territories as needed." Port Royal, the administrative heart of British Caribbean operations, where ambitious officers built careers and political connections, a place where William Ashford could reclaim his lost respectability, where his past as Captain Blackwood might be quietly forgotten in favor of his potential future service to the Crown. Elena appeared in the doorway of the tavern where they had been meeting, her dark eyes finding his face with the unerring accuracy that had marked their relationship from the beginning. She carried a basket containing lunch for the workers, rebuilding the damaged sections of town, her small hands steady despite the responsibility she bore for tasks that should have fallen to Captain Ashford. She said formally, using the title he had asked her to adopt when others were present. "Mama sent me to tell you that the Martinez family's roof is finished. Mr. Santos says they can move back into their house tomorrow." Commander Harrison studied Elena with the polite interest of a man encountering a curiosity. "This is the child you've been helping?" he asked after she had continued on her errands. "She's the child who helped me," Blackwood corrected, watching Elena's small figure navigate through the busy street with practiced ease. "She and her family saved my life in ways that have nothing to do with medicine or shelter." "I see." Harrison's tone suggested he didn't see at all, but was too polite to say so directly. "Well, your charitable work here is certainly commendable, but surely you understand that your talents could serve a much broader purpose in an official capacity." Blackwood folded the letter carefully, creasing the heavy paper along lines that seemed to divide his possible futures into neat, manageable sections. "What guarantees do I have that my service would actually protect innocent people rather than simply advancing bureaucratic careers?" Harrison's surprise was evident. "Sir, you'd be serving the Crown directly, the very institution you swore to protect when you first accepted your commission. The same institution that abandoned me to die in a Spanish prison when political expedience demanded a scapegoat." Blackwood replied without bitterness, simply stating a fact that had shaped 20 years of his life. "That was a regrettable mistake," Harrison acknowledged. "But surely you can't let past injustices prevent you from serving the greater good now." Blackwood watched Elena disappear around a corner, her mission of mercy completed with the efficiency that had allowed her to hold her family together through their darkest days. He thought about the town council meetings where he had helped plan defenses that relied on community cooperation rather than military force, about the network of former victims who were learning to protect each other through shared vigilance and mutual aid. "The greater good," he repeated thoughtfully. "Commander, in your estimation, what constitutes the greater good?" Impressive reports, filed with distant superiors, or actual changes in the daily lives of people who need protection. Harrison's jaw tightened slightly, suggesting this conversation wasn't proceeding as he had expected. Both, naturally. Effective administration enables effective action. Sometimes, Blackwood agreed, and sometimes administration becomes an end in itself, while the people it's supposed to serve continue to suffer. The commander gathered his papers with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to having his offers accepted without philosophical debate. "I'll need your answer by tomorrow evening," he said. The Admiral expects a prompt response to his generosity. After Harrison left, Blackwood sat alone in the tavern, studying the letter that offered him everything he had once thought he wanted: respectability, authority, the chance to erase 20 years of questionable choices with distinguished service to legitimate causes. But respectability felt less important now than the sound of Elena's laughter when her little sister took her first steps, or the gratitude in Maria's eyes when she spoke of her family's future. Some forms of service, he had learned, couldn't be measured in official commendations or bureaucratic approval. 5 years had transformed Elena from a desperate child into a confident young woman of 12, her dark eyes still holding the wisdom that had first captured Blackwood's attention, but now tempered with the joy that comes from a life lived without fear. She sat at the wooden desk he had built for her, carefully copying passages from a mathematics text while sunlight streamed through windows that no longer needed to be covered with oiled paper. The small house had grown over the years, expanded room by room as Blackwood's carpentry skills and his careful management of former pirate wealth allowed the family to thrive. Maria had recovered completely from her fever, her strength returning along with her laughter. The younger children had grown tall and healthy, their early memories of starvation and terror fading into stories they only half remembered. "Professor Ashford," Elena said, using the title that had become natural, after years of him teaching not just her family, but dozens of other children in Port Isabella's small but growing school. "Mrs. Rodriguez says her son Miguel wants to join the Merchant Marine. Should I give him one of your navigation books?" Blackwood looked up from the lesson plans he was preparing for the next day's classes, surprised as always by how naturally Elena had taken to organizing the educational resources that had slowly accumulated in their community. She had become his unofficial assistant, helping younger students with their letters, while mastering mathematics and navigation with the quick intelligence she had inherited from her father. "Miguel Rodriguez?" Blackwood asked, remembering the boy whose mother had named him after his father, the same Rodriguez who had died challenging his captain's transformation. "He's only 14, old enough to start learning proper seamanship instead of picking up bad habits from fishing boat captains who navigate by instinct." Elena replied with the practical wisdom that had marked all her observations. "Besides, you always say that good navigation can prevent more problems than it solves." The irony wasn't lost on him, teaching young men to sail safely and honestly, using skills he had learned during 20 years of theft and violence. Commander Harrison had visited twice more over the years, each time offering increasingly prestigious positions that would take Blackwood away from Port Isabella and back into the world of official recognition and institutional authority. Each time, Blackwood had politely declined, explaining that his work here was not finished. Harrison had eventually stopped coming, though the offers continued to arrive by mail, as if the Royal Navy couldn't quite believe that a man would choose teaching children over commanding fleets. "Elena," Maria called from the kitchen, where she was preparing the evening meal with ingredients purchased from their own small garden and the market stalls that now thrived in Port Isabella's rebuilt commercial district. "Ask Professor Ashford if he'll be joining us for dinner, or if he plans to spend another evening grading papers by lamplight." Elena grinned, the expression transforming her serious face into something radiant. "She's worried you're working too hard again. She says teachers need to eat properly or they start making mistakes with arithmetic." Blackwood set aside his lesson plans, recognizing the gentle but firm intervention that had become familiar over the years. Maria had appointed herself guardian of his health and happiness with the same determination she brought to caring for her own children, and he had learned not to argue with her maternal instincts. The drawing Elena had made of him hung framed above the fireplace, a child's interpretation that showed him not as the scarred pirate he had been, but as the man she had always believed he could become. In her artwork, he wore no weapons and bore no marks of violence, simply standing with his hand extended toward a group of children who looked up at him with trust and affection. "Professor," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone that indicated she was working through something important. "Do you ever miss it? The sailing, the adventure, the feeling of being free on the open ocean?" Blackwood considered the question seriously, as he did all of Elena's inquiries. She deserved honest answers, not comfortable lies designed to protect her from complexity. "I miss the sailing," he admitted. "There's something about being at sea that makes a man feel connected to forces larger than himself, but I don't miss the rest of it. The violence, the constant fear, the way we had to harden our hearts against other people's suffering." Elena nodded, absorbing this information with the gravity she brought to all learning. "Maybe someday we could take a boat out together, not for piracy or treasure hunting, but just to see what's beyond the horizon." "Maybe we could," Blackwood agreed, though he suspected that whatever lay beyond the horizon couldn't compare to the treasure he had already found in this small house, with this remarkable family who had taught him that the greatest adventures were often the ones that led a person home. Outside, the evening breeze carried the sounds of children playing in streets that no longer echoed with fear, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the peaceful end of another day in a community that had learned to protect its own through love rather than violence.